Thank you. My name is Eilidh. I'm a wind turbine engineer, so I wanted to speak up on the fact that William keeps bashing them. Look, I think we all recognise that ideally you wouldn't be putting wind turbines in areas of natural beauty, and it's not an ideal situation. But the fact is we are faced with a very serious issue in terms of climate change, and whilst it might not be the best way of going about doing it, it certainly needs to be done. And I just wanted to make that point.
Deal with this. If you can Google these things, you put it up on the thing, you see the energy contributions being made by different sources of energy.
I've got it right here if you want to know.
I've got it there, and when I press the wrong button by mistake, it always comes up rather than the book I'm writing. So I always find it quite interesting, and I'm not quite sure what it is. But it shows the contribution. It does vary from the lows that William was talking about. And at maximum, when you've got sort of winds blowing very strongly over the country, it goes up to about 10, 12% sometimes, doesn't it?
I think
of demand.
Is it 15 or 20% across the UK?
Can I just add?
William, yes, come back.
I just wanted to make the point that, I mean, this is well known, but I'd actually quite like to ask Barry and Natalie actually directly about this. As you know, when the wind doesn't blow, doesn't generate electricity, but when it blows too hard, we have to pay, I think it was over 50 million or whatever it was last year in compensation. Do you honestly think that's an effective way of illustrating how subsidy works?
I'll give that you can. Well, no, I want you to come back because you were sort of listening very intently to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fair point, and that is the way the mechanism works, and it's not ideal. But there are reasons why, to a certain degree, you do have to incentivise if you're at higher wind speed in terms of integrity of turbines, and I won't go into all the boring detail of it. But again, a system needs to be put in place to encourage these forms of energy to be developed, because the need is there. Fundamentally, the need is there, and you're completely not recognising the criticality associated with climate change and how we, as a country, need to address this issue. Not to mention.
I'm just going to say one quick point. We also live in a democracy, and I do want to come back to the point I made at the very beginning of my opening statement, that instead of getting into an idealistic debate, what I would like to actually remind people is that we have a Localism Act and we have a democracy whereby effectively these wind turbines do not have a democratic mandate, and local communities who have been consulted are completely ignored. And this is not about sentiment about climate change, and I'm completely aware of that. It's the fact that we have laws in place that protect the AONB, and increasingly what is happening is that planning inspectors are overruling. And for example, where I live in Shropshire in Much Wenlock, we've just had permission for a wind turbine right slap bang on the middle of Wenlock Edge, which is one of the iconic parts of the Shropshire landscape. I cannot believe that people in this room, I'm sure, who love the countryside, necessarily think that's a good thing. Who in this room?
William.
Who thinks that a turbine?
No, we're not going to do all that. What we will do is, given what you say about localism and the importance of localism in this, and you think localism should prevail, you also have polls that show you that the majority of the population are enthusiastic about onshore wind because they believe that it is a contribution to solving the problems of climate change. When you talk about democracy, do you discount that polling at a sort of macro level and exclusively concentrate on the local level?
I haven't. All I can say is that having fought various wind turbine campaigns, when you see these polls, what tends to happen is that green activists do mass emails, and I've seen this because I've studied it. You look at any planning application, that's why in Shropshire they've now said that anyone who wants to post a point has to actually come from the locality. Yes. I'm afraid these polls are inaccurate, and they are often cultivated by by firms such as Renewable UK for their own propaganda purposes.
Natalie, briefly.
Well, Jonathan, you brought up what I was going to bring up, which is the polls that show that people would far prefer in their backyard wind turbines to fracking, and those are polls conducted by generally, utterly recognised professional polling firms that no one is able to vary. But I do just want to pick up a really particular point and the use of a word here. We had describing as sort of doing environmentally responsibly things as idealism. That is realism. It's recognising the reality of climate change. That's the reality, the scientific reality we're living in, and let's not anyone call it anything else.
Let me just ask, whichever you would like to answer this point. Another point made by William, which our questioner sort of said, yes, it is a bit bizarre that when the wind blows too strongly, you compensate the producer of the energy, which seems to him a curious way of using public funds. One of you answer this.
I'm happy to answer that point. I mean, I think we understand that we are in a situation where we are going to have an energy mix. And for example, I think the renewable energy that's being produced up in my part of the world is actually sustaining the gas power station because of that interplay between traditional fossil fuel production and the renewables that are now coming on stream and playing such an important part. I mean, it's saved millions of tons of carbon over the last few years and offset untold environmental damage that we would be having to deal with. And just on the point about communities, we have a democratically accountable planning system, and no turbine can get planning permission without that going through the locally elected representatives. And I know that although these developments are sometimes controversial, sometimes they're really not. And I can think of communities that actually own their own turbine in my constituency. I can think of other developments where the community has a big stake as shareholders in the development, and that's been able to bring huge benefits to communities. It's kept sports facilities open, it keeps roofs on village halls, etc. So, you know, I think it has to be accountable to communities, but sometimes the communities actually want to play their part in reducing climate emissions.
Okay, I'm going to go on to our next question, which relates to species and habitats. Stephanie Ray, if you would.
Hello. The recent State of Nature report demonstrated that 60% of UK species are in decline and that only 37% of our protected sites are in favourable condition. Our current approach to managing biodiversity through site and species protection isn't working, and yet the industry is accused of gold-plating regulations. How would the panel members address this, and what would your proposals be to manage both terrestrial and marine natural capital sustainably?
Wow, we could have it's such an important territory, we could have a series of quite long and intriguing essays on that. So can I ask our panel, just to be relatively succinct, just to remind you of the key thing, that the core proposal from Stephanie is that the present approach to managing diversity through site and species protection is not working, while the conservation sector is accused of, quotes, gold-plating regulation. So obviously you're going to address that, and in that context, what would your priorities be? It's given you time to decide what the most succinct way of expressing your views are. Barry, first of all.
It's a great question, can I just say that? I think you've just got to go with John Lawton, actually. It's bigger, better, more joined up. It's management at a landscape scale. And if we move to managing at a landscape scale and stop simply looking at protection of habitats and species, of course it's important to focus on species, and Matt Shardlow, who's sitting somewhere down there, would go mad if I didn't say it was important to focus on species. But looking at this joined up at a landscape scale is absolutely essential. And you talked about natural capital and ecosystems. And, you know, one of the really important things that we have to do now is to get the Treasury framework for accounting to take on board the system of environmental economic accounting that is supposed to be coming in 2020 under the UN framework, okay, as the basis for accounting, so that we have those parallel accounts, so that precisely the sort of things that the Natural Capital Committee has been showing about value and benefit are taken account in the decision-making process, the cost-benefit analyses that are carried on within government. And if we can drive that forward and do that at a landscape scale, we'll actually then begin to reverse the declines that the State of Nature report and so on are showing.
Thank you. Rupert, it's claimed that it's not working, the present policy, by Stephanie Ray. So what would you do?
Well, so it is just worth saying that research by Baker et al. Has shown that environmental stewardship does have benefits for biodiversity, and some species have been doing better. Red kite, otter, the large blue butterfly, for example. But
Isn't the fact that
we
you
need
can
to do
name
better.
them so easily suggests that there is a sort of problem here?
But Others are not. And specifically, I would name farmland birds as a category, woodland birds as a category, and pollinators. And Barry's right, actually, that we do need to do this at a landscape scale, and that's why we will be building on the nature improvement area concept in the new countryside stewardship scheme. We will specifically be incentivising landscape scale approaches. But secondly, we also need to be more granular about our approach. As I say, some species do need particular help, and the new countryside stewardship scheme will ensure that that happens.
Do you believe that the decline, the state of nature, that 6% decline, as you say, some are bottoming out, some of the situation is improving. Do you believe, however, that the decline, and you can around the world, the decline is not entirely dissimilar. Do you see that decline as inevitable, or do you believe you can arrest all decline?
I don't think it is inevitable, no. The British Trust for Ornithology did do their annual report, and I think I'm right in saying they show that sort of birds as a whole are roughly holding their own, but within that, as I say, there are some categories that are doing particularly badly and some that are doing much better. What we have to do is attend to those that are not doing so well.
So the policy would be re-elect Tory government and you get arrest and then reversal of decline across the piece.
Yeah.
Well, there you are. You heard it here first. Tweet away. Kate.
Well, I don't want to repeat because I think there's quite a lot of similarity in our views with those of Barry and with Rupert. The one thing I would say that I think where Liberal Democrats would go further is, I mean, this government has introduced a national infrastructure plan, which is about identifying what are the capital projects that this government is going to support and drive forward over the next 25 years. We believe there needs to be a nature recovery plan as well. Not a separate document, but integrated within that, which looks at issues of what are the resources that we need to protect, the natural capital, and picks up issues around species and habitats. And therefore, you have a clear plan of what is the vision you want for Britain in 20 years, which is about the infrastructure projects you need and the natural capital and the habitats and the biodiversity that you need to protect. Because only that way will you not only get the leadership across government, which we know is absolutely vital, but also starts to identify some of the funding streams which are going to be needed, both public-private partnerships and government incentives, to deliver on these projects. And I would just say the one other thing, again, I think is critical if we are going to deliver for habitats and species in the future is we have to continue with the Natural Capital Committee. We have to make sure that that is on a statutory footing into the future.
Natalie Bennett.
Well, Jonathan, since you sort of raised the global issue, there's just one figure that I think we've just got to mark this evening, which is the figure that came from WWF a couple of months ago. We have, in the past 40 years, that's in my lifetime, I'm 49, in the last 40 years around the globe, we have lost 50% of our vertebrate wildlife. There is half the number of wild animals in the world now that there were 40 years ago. And that really tells us on that global scale just how much we're trashing this planet. And we've got to focus on that. But coming back to the question in terms of Britain, I mean, I said quite a bit about this in my introductory remarks. I mean, obviously, a Nature and Wellbeing Act that says where we are now has just, is dreadful and needs to rapidly improve. I entirely agree about the landscape scale. Historically, we've had this big focus on this little, these pockets, and we know the pockets just don't work for wildlife populations. That just simply isn't an approach that works. We have to have the whole landscape that works for biodiversity. We've got to, I talked a bit about the Common Agricultural Policy reforming. And I again come back to a point here, as a point that I think we've all got to be making collectively, which is, we had a lot of discussion, I visited the Somerset levels, flooding is a huge issue, a huge concern to large numbers of communities. Doing things that help wildlife can also really do things that help with our whole catchment management, preventing flooding. All of these things link up, and we can say to people, we can help the biodiversity, help the wildlife, and help you at the same time. It's really important that democratically we're making sure people know that and understand that, and how much their life is better if it's also better for the wildlife.
I want to bring in here, because we've got quite a lot in this territory. Stephen Drury, which relates to EU legislation. Stephen Drury, your question, if you would.
Yes, so my question to the panel is, if you were elected, would you guarantee that the EU nature directives and relevant UK legislation would be reinforced to protect our threatened wildlife from major development schemes?
Kate, you're smiling away with pleasure at the sound of the word EU.
Well, yes, I am. I'll come on to you, but I'm even more excited if I were elected. If only, I say. I was just so disappointed that
we can take it. Let's say for the purposes of this argument, it's a matter of some doubt about how many seats you might get. Let's assume that the Liberal Democrats are elected, not you personally, from your preeminence in the House of Lords.
Indeed. Well, I think, and I'm sure I'm going to disagree with William on this, I think Europe is brilliant for our environment, and we've only got to see the progress we've made on the common fisheries policies. I mean, the common agricultural policy is not perfect, but it's slowly making some slight progress, and obviously climate change. Having a strong voice in Europe on environmental issues is absolutely critical, and there are some fantastic directives in Europe, the Water Framework Directive, the Habitats Directive, those we need to protect. And Liberal Democrats will be championing our role in Europe, because we know that in Europe we are stronger in the world to deal particularly with the issue of climate change. But we need to make sure that European directives work better together in our national legislation.
Would you, Rupert, I'll come to you in a moment. Rupert, would you agree with the same passion there about Europe that Kate has elaborated, that it's absolutely critical to be in there because it's central to solving some of these great problems?
I would agree with that bit, yes. I think Europe does help in a number of ways, but it's also very challenging in a number of other ways. And we need to be in there because we need to be negotiating.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. So whatever the frustrating or discouraging things about Europe, because of the importance of this, you yourself, if there were to be a referendum which allowed you to choose, would opt to stay in Europe, given the importance of the issue?
Well, that, as you know, is subject to an extensive renegotiation. So I would have to say that I would need to wait to see the outcome of that renegotiation.
So you could imagine liberating, in inverted commas, as William Cash's party would, you can imagine liberating yourself from Europe despite how important you believe these directives are?
Well, if we were to go that far, we would clearly need to put in place our own protections along those lines.
William Cash.
Well, I think...
you need the microphone, I think.
I think UKIP's position on Europe is pretty clear. I don't need to go into it. I do want to go back to the question before in relation to habitat. I mean, for example, take the decline of the hedgehog, which we've seen a 90% decline, which has partly as a result of the number of badgers, of which hedgehogs are a favourite delicacy. Now, I know this is again a contentious issue, but the reality is that there is a destructive part played by badgers, and they do kill hedgehogs. And I think we have to have a realistic approach to the eco-habitat.
William, may I introduce here a question in direct relation to this? I don't want to stop you, it's an important area. Rosie Woodruff on this. Rosie, where are you?
Thank you very much indeed.
Gorgeous.
After an independent expert panel concluded that the 2013 badger culls were neither effective nor humane, the government dispensed with independent oversight. What role do the panellists envision for independent scientific advice in deciding environmental policies?
Rupert. Is that a fair characterisation, Rupert, of the government policy? You dispensed with the independent oversight because it told you something you didn't want to hear, is the charge?
Of course not. Science and evidence are at the heart of all we do at DEFRA. I work very closely with the Chief Scientific Advisor and indeed the Chief Plant Health Officer, which is my side of the business. We have a brand new plant biosecurity strategy. We have a tree health management plan. We have a plant health risk register. We have been very much focused on improving plant health since the cholera outbreak brought home to us that we were ill-prepared.
And badgers?
Well, badgers, TB is costing us £100 million a year, and it is leading to the deaths, premature and unnecessary deaths of 30,000 cattle. We have in place a comprehensive strategy to deal with TB, which includes improved movement controls of cattle, better biosecurity on farm. It includes vaccination in the edge area. But no country in the world, Jonathan, no country in the world has attained TB-free status without also addressing it in the reservoir in wildlife. And in this country, the reservoir in wildlife is in badgers.
But the point here is the great many people share that view, particularly those who live in rural parts of England and those who seek to farm, obviously. But if the independent expert panel says it ain't working, you say, OK, we're still not going to fix it. We're going to carry on as we did, but we're going to ignore what they said. Isn't that crudely what did happen?
Absolutely not. No, we absolutely took their advice, particularly on the issues that Rosie raises. And this year, in fact, it was audited, and there were no such problems that occurred.
OK, you've been very patient, eh?
Obviously, in Scotland, we've not gone down the route of badger cull because we don't have the same problems with TB. I don't think anyone should underestimate the seriousness of TB in livestock and in the wider environment. But I'm actually really interested in the evidence that's due to come out from Northern Ireland, where they do have a TB problem and where they've been using alternatives to a badger cull. And I think the government really needs to look at the evidence and see what's working to address what is a very serious issue. But if it's working
sorry to be sort of
and
nerdy about it, but Northern Ireland is quite a discrete area in relation to the number of badgers that are causing a problem and the ability to identify the areas in which they live, isn't it? And the alleged difference between that and England is that in England they're spread across the West Country and elsewhere, and the swathe is so much greater, and therefore the measures that are being taken in Northern Ireland aren't necessarily applicable to the wider area.
Clearly, you can't always just kind of parachute in one methodology, but I think there's nevertheless a great deal of learning that can be taken from different parts of Europe, how these things have been successfully addressed. But I am really quite concerned about the way in which evidence seems to be being ignored in England in terms of the effectiveness of the badger cull. And if I can just go very briefly back to the previous question about biodiversity, obviously that's a devolved issue in Scotland, but the EU legislation, the directives that the questioner referred to at the outset, those are picked up in the Scottish Government's 2020 challenge for biodiversity, which was published in 2013 and is an update of the previous biodiversity strategy. So maybe that's a nerdy point as well, but that's where to find out more information about that.
What would you do about badgers if Labour was elected?
We're very clear that we will observe the science. Look, Rosie is probably the premier epidemiologist on this in the country. What she says is indisputably right, and what the government did is it just said, fine, in future, we didn't like the scientific report that we got back on the first culls. In future, we're not going to have a scientific report back on the culls.
Let me ask Rosie. Let me go back to Rosie on this.
Well, can I just elaborate?
Yeah, sure.
Then by all means bring Rosie in, because she's the expert.
I want to ask you that specifically. Some of us have had an opportunity to read some of what you've written, not with the expertise that you obviously have. Is it your view that you do need to cull the badger population, and that the badgers are one of the creatures that are responsible for infecting farm animals with all the consequences that Rupert described?
Absolutely. Bovine tuberculosis is a terrible problem for farmers in Britain. Badgers are involved. Badgers are part of the problem, no question. And anybody who says different doesn't know what they're talking about.
And given that, do you I mean, scientists can say this ain't working, mate. Do you have a notion of what would work? A vaccination program?
So the problem is that once you start to cull badgers, you have these unexpected consequences, which means that culling badgers, despite badgers' role, can make TB problem in cattle worse rather than better. Yes, there are other things that you can do. There are other things you can explore. In West Cornwall, we're trialling the vaccination of badgers to see what role that might play. But I think that There's a lot that can be done with cattle-to-cattle transmission as well. And I should say I'm not the biggest expert on this because I've seen some other TB experts in the room.
Modesty. Okay, Barry, just so you want to finish off your point.
No, look, we would absolutely insist that there was the scientific review, but we have said we will stop the culling absolutely on day one for precisely the reasons. We accept entirely what Rosie said, that bovine TB is an enormous problem. About £100 million a year this is costing the public purse, and farmers, it's devastating for farmers to have this. But what we say is we have to look at far better biosecurity on farms as well as looking at the vaccination programme of badgers, because of precisely what Rosie's talking about, which is the perturbation effect. It goes right back to the Krebs report, almost 10 years ago now, where he set out the difficulties, and this was done, this was trialled, and he set out very clearly the difficulties of doing this unless you did it both at scale and at a percentage of the badger population that was not going to then result in it spilling over and actually causing greater problems in bovine TB than you were trying to solve.
There are significant numbers significant number of voters who are opposed in principle to the killing or culling of badgers, whatever means that were decided as being effective. It isn't your position. It isn't Labour's position that no badgers must be killed.
Labour's position is that we will stop the culls on day one of a Labour government.
That's not answering my question. In principle, are you opposed or not opposed? I think it's very important for a significant number of voters whether you're opposed in principle to culling, if you could find a way that satisfied the scientists.
What I think has been shown by all the attempts to do a cull is that it is not possible to do it in the way that was outlined by Krebs without sustaining exactly the problems that Rosie's talked about.
Sorry, perhaps I'm just not being... Perhaps I'm asking the question in a confused way. I have a feeling I might not be. But just allow me to persist one more time. I want to ask you, in principle, are you opposed to taking life away from badgers in order to have some effect on the bovine TB problem, if there was a way of achieving that met the criteria set by scientists?
Yes, I understand your question perfectly, and I will answer it perfectly.
It's a yes or no?
No, it's not, actually.
I'm almost inclined to ask a show of hands on that, but I shan't.
Because
actually, Press, I will if you go on.
There are other ways of doing it, such as vaccination of badgers program. So you can solve the problem in other ways, and these are the primary ways in terms of bovine, in terms of biosecurity on farms and on badger vaccination.
Natalie, and then back over here, and then we must move on.
Just a little reflection, really. I mean, I entirely agree that what we're seeing is the government utterly ignoring the science, and there is a sort of parallel with the previous Labour government with certain issues on illegal drugs, where they also ignored the expert scientific advice. But I think I was on the ground with the wounded badger patrols, year, 18 months or so back now, and one of the things that there's been very little talking about is how much damage it's done to those communities as well. That communities have actually been torn apart by people feeling like they're on different sides or they're forced into different sides. It's been very disruptive as well. It's inhumane, it's unscientific, it has to stop. But I do just also want to pick up, since I didn't get a chance to get in on the previous question about European nature directives, and the question was actually, can we guarantee to improve them? And no, we can't, because it depends on the whole politics of Europe. What I can guarantee to do is fight extremely hard to improve them. And one of the things that hasn't come up this evening that I think we really should mention is the proposed EU-US free trade deal known as TTIP, which is a huge threat to the environmental standards and workers' rights standards and lots of other standards, which the Green Party is utterly opposed to and is a huge issue for Europe and for the UK.
Anyone want to come back in on that?
Can I just come back on, Rosie mentioned the issue of perturbation, which is absolutely right, which is that if you allow farmers willy-nilly to go around culling badgers, they will move around, it encourages them to move around more, and that will spread TB, and she's absolutely right. And actually, the evidence of the randomized badger cull trials in the early 2000s was that you need to do it in large areas with hard edges. They used 10 areas of about 100 square kilometres, I think. we are using 2 areas of between 200 and 300 square kilometres with as hard edges as we can get.
Are they, Rosie? Are they doing their best to meet your criteria? Although they didn't like the independent
Yes, they've designed the licensing criteria to try and fit to what the scientific evidence suggested. But the problem is that if the estimates of badger numbers are correct and the estimates of the proportion of badgers killed are correct, then they've just not been able to reduce the badger density sufficiently to be confident of controlling the disease. They're in the zone where they're risking making it worse.
Okay.
I just want to say one more thing on, I mean, I agree, by the way, about the important thing Barry mentioned of movement controls and biosecurity on farm. I absolutely agree about that. But vaccination has been much talked about, and we are indeed undertaking vaccination in the what we call the edge area. We have a high-risk area, which is the southwest of the country. We have an edge area which surrounds that, and then the north and indeed Scotland are the lower-risk areas. If you can do vaccination in areas where badgers, where TB is not endemic in the, if that's the right word, in the badger population, it can work. It's much less likely to work in the high-risk areas. The reasons are that you have to, first of all, you have to do it every year, and secondly, that obviously it is of no use if the badger is already infected. So there are limitations, but there is nonetheless a place for vaccination.
I'm going to move us on to our next question, which is it's on technology, specifically biotechnology. Sean May Gardiner.
In light of the growing pressures on food security in the UK, what role do you see for biotechnologies such as, dare I say it, GM, and also advanced sustainable practices in meeting this challenge?
Can you elaborate briefly on what you regard as advanced sustainable practices?
So, for instance, in regards to soil science, at the offset of greater yield, you might reduce tillage to then protect the soil bank in the long term.
Okay, food security, biotechnology, and of course GM, another highly controversial, contentious topic. Given these pressures, what's your view, Kate?
Well, as Liberal Democrats, we've always said we're not opposed fundamentally to GM foods, but we have some real concerns about the strength of feeling that some of our coalition colleagues, and I wouldn't put Rupert in this catalogue, but certainly when Owen Paterson was Secretary of State, the cheerleading role that the Secretary of State played for GMs, I felt was certainly went beyond where the coalition wanted to be. There are still question marks about the environmental impacts of GM foods. And there are really still important questions, given that food is so fundamental to people, about taking people along with you in those decisions. And so we feel that there needs to be a bigger conversation with the public about that. But we also feel that the government needs to do more to support agroecological approaches to future food challenges. I think Barry mentioned the fact that, with so many more people coming into the world, we are going to have to find some new innovative solutions to produce that food. Some of that will be about reducing food waste, which I think is an area where we don't have enough priority. We see a lot of emphasis rightly going on developing new solutions and encouraging businesses to produce the right type of food. But if we're wasting about 30% of food in the world, we need to, at the same time, be looking at how we can reduce waste before we just look to new technology. So I'm not opposed, Liberal Democrats aren't opposed in principle to all new solutions. There may be options out there which can help, but at the same time we need to focus much more on reducing food waste.
Natalie, are you at Root and Branch opposed to GM as this form of technology?
We're not opposed to GM research. We are opposed to the release of GM crops into the environment. I think the fact is, I mean, basically GM is the technology of industrial agriculture, and I started off talking way back about the problem of industrial agriculture. I mean, I think your second set of solutions there, agroecology, working with the natural environment we've got now, and particularly working on a small scale with the environment on the small scale, that's the direction that we very much need to go in. And that means things like reduced tillage. It horrifies me to see the continuing high levels of tillage that we have around the country as I go on trains up and down the country, going back to this point about soils. And I think behind that is a whole kind of government approach that thinks that the only real agriculture, the only commercially viable agriculture is big agriculture. And I think we need to bring things down onto a much smaller scale, where you're working with the ecology on a very, very small scale level. And that simply, GM isn't the kind of technology that produces that. Local knowledge, local experience, diversity in the crops that you're growing, that's the kind of thing that gives you that kind of food security, not big-scale industrial agriculture, which GM is the technology of.
Thank you. Rupert, was Owen Paterson wrong to be, as he's described, as a cheerleader, as I think Kate said, your coalition partner?
No, he wasn't. But before I say anything else, the government is completely clear that anything we do must be safe for humans and for the environment. But I was quite struck by, I think, is his name Mark Lannis, who is the gentleman who was violently anti-GM, but who was converted, I think, by seeing effectively the effects of starving Africans and the fact that we have got a global population which is going to grow from 7 to 9 billion by 2050, and we've got to feed people. And every technology that is out there has to be investigated thoroughly. I happen to believe that GM can be safe, and EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency, has conducted a review and has concluded that there is no evidence that it is inherently unsafe.
What do you do as a politician if you believe that, and yet the public, the consumer, does not want to take food that is, or buy food that is produced or has GM in it? Do you leave it to the market, despite what you've said? Or do you, and if they say we don't actually want these crops to be grown, do you have to override that in the interests of what you see as the bigger picture?
I mean, these questions, of course, are difficult, but I think that if politicians believe it is safe, then they should say so. And indeed, I think that I have noticed a shift in opinion. I was in front of the Science and Technology Committee, Select Committee of the House of Commons recently on GM, and they and the vast majority of the witnesses who addressed them were convinced that it could be safe. And I think it's for us to say so.
Barry.
Almost 75 billion tonnes of UK topsoil is being lost each year, simply washed away. If you look at a satellite photograph of the UK, you'll see it being washed out, flushed out into the coast through our river system. Europe is losing its topsoil 17 times faster than it is possible to replace it. Not as bad as China. They're losing it at 57 times as fast as it's possible to replace it. You've talked about the need for greater intensification. Actually, I don't know whether you're for it or against it, but the question you pose is
well,
greater...
you could answer the question.
Well, I am a PhD student in agri-food and plant sciences, so it's about weighing up the evidence.
Great.
You have an open mind at the moment.
Good.
Well, I'm still studying, so...
Excellent.
Most people are still studying in their lives, and often they have very hard and fast views. But anyway, you have an open mind on it.
But fine. Look, what I would say is that in a world where we're looking at an expansion of the global population from the 7 billion that it is now to 9.5 billion, perhaps 10, we are going to need to use our resources to produce more food. One of the ways I think we should be looking to do that is actually by bringing back into use the 500 million hectares of degraded land, degraded forest land on the whole, and making sure that they are put into productive use.
Sorry, when you say degraded forest land, are you talking about land that's been harvested for the wood?
No,
or are you talking about it just...
On the whole, what it is it's land that was forest that was then used often for slash and burn agriculture, wasted in that way, and then we need to be reclaiming that land and bring it back for replantation and forestry.
Right.
But there's much more sustainable use for agriculture that needs to go on, and there's all part of tackling the problem of climate change and the problem of basically all the AHE targets right around the world. Specifically on GM, because it's the sort of key question here, I would agree that I'm not against GM in principle. I think there need to be proper safeguards. I think one of the interesting things about the whole GM process is that if in science you can identify what you're doing, that you're taking this gene and you're manipulating it in this way, of course you need in the laboratory and through trials to then be able to see what the outcomes of that are and to be sure that you don't infect other crops through that. But it's better that you know exactly which gene you've taken and what you've done with it than the old way of plant breeding, which was just to cross, hope for the best, and see what the result was. Because that way, you couldn't actually undo what you were doing. I mean, if you go back a couple of centuries, it was very much a suck-it-and-see approach. That led to many developments which were beneficial for agriculture and beneficial for food security. I believe we need to use GM properly in that way, but with control.
Eilidh and then William.
I think it's really important that we understand that the world does currently produce more than enough food to meet its population's needs. The question, people who are hungry in the world today are not hungry because of a lack of food, it's because they don't have money to buy the food. And that's as true of people in developing countries as it is of 400,000 people using food banks here in the UK. So let's be really clear about that. GM is a bit of a red herring in the whole question of food security. Now, as far as GM is concerned, I'm fairly agnostic. I'm keen to listen to the evidence and I'm keen to particularly assess the impact on biodiversity because I think that's where a lot of the concerns have risen. But if I can make an observation, certainly in Scotland, where we've seen an exponential improvement and growth in our food exports over the last 7 years or so, that's been very much in premium, high-quality markets, whether that's our beef, whether that's our whisky, but it's the value-added products that we can source and say that this is the very best quality. And frankly, GM doesn't help us do that.
William.
The issue of GM is a subject that the UKIP want to put to the British Parliament. But I also think that it is, I totally agree with Rupert.
How do you mean put to the British Parliament?
Put to the British Parliament in the sense that it's something that the House can vote on. If I can just continue.
You mean for or against?
Yeah, right, exactly. So I think that I think we absolutely have to look at the research. I think Rupert is absolutely right, and Barry, in relation to the fact we do have large increasing population to feed. The truth is that if we don't look at these technologies, British farmers could easily be completely outpriced, and that is a real issue. But I want to talk about the subject of food labelling, because GMs is related to that in terms of the way that people identify food. I personally believe that we should have the right green mix, we should have the right food mix. I think food miles are a serious issue. Personally, I like the idea that British sausages can be properly labelled British sausages. I think that we should have local food webs, as the campaign for the protection of rural England have advanced. I think it's an extremely good idea. I live in Shropshire, where we have a local food web. And I think that that's the right approach. Give people the choice if they want to buy local food. I think we have to look at the technology of GM, but I think it's absolutely essential. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that even if it does cost a little bit more, people will go and buy local carrots and local food, and I think that's a very good thing, that we give people the choice.
Thank you. We're beginning to get close to our time, and I've got two more questions, one of which is relatively conceivably answerable in a brief way. I know what I'm going to ask you, just in principle on GM. Those who favour the development of GM, subject to certain safeguards that we are clear that it's beneficial, as it were, before, or clear it's not going to cause undue damage. Who's in favour of, which hands up, the further development? Who's opposed to the further development of GM, root and branch? Who's sort of open-minded and doesn't know enough about it at the moment? Well, maybe you've got a bit of elucidation there, I don't know, because there's a significant proportion that are in that state. Our next question is from Mark Avery. Mark, where are you?
Thanks very much. The panel's been very keen on landscape scale approaches, so would they ban grouse shooting?
Would you ban grouse shooting? Right, here goes. First of all, Eilidh.
Well, I suspect in Scotland we've got more grouse shooting than in any other part of the UK. No, I wouldn't ban it, but one thing I would like to do is see it pay its way through normal business taxation, which it's been exempt from for a long time, and I think it's high time that those rural tourist businesses start making a contribution to the local government coffers in the same way as every other business in the rural economy has to do.
Thank you. Barry?
We would end the illegal persecution of birds of prey and raptor persecution. Mark is one of the sort of leading campaigners on this in the country, and I was with him at the Hen Harrier Day earlier in the year. So it's absolutely essential that we stop the illegal practices that are going on grouse moors, where people, gamekeepers and others, are shooting and poisoning some of the most beautiful raptors that we have in this country. We would also conduct a review to make sure that snaring is being used properly on grouse moors and in other places. And we would have a review of shooting practices, because the lead shot review that was promised for the beginning of this year, about 5 years ago, if I remember, still hasn't come back. And yet in 1983, we were still saying that we should have a future that is free of lead shot. So all of those impact on grouse moors, but we're not in a position, I think, at the moment to say that we would outright ban grouse moors.
Okay. Would you ban it, Rupert?
No. You won't be surprised to hear. You might like to know that I've never shot a grouse in my life. But
Do you regard those who do as murderers?
No.
You sounded almost as if you did.
No. I'm
It's just a distaste for it, or because you didn't actually manage to hit it?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. You're absolutely right. I'm a hopeless shot. But I think there are important economic benefits for the areas in which it goes on. A number of people, a lot of people make a living from it, which is important. Shooting generally also does have benefits for biodiversity more generally, because, for instance, birds have to be fed in the winter, and other birds benefit from that. I agree with Barry about stamping out illegal practices, and I'm very keen to proceed with the Hen Harrier action plan, and I'm waiting for those members of the group to come forward with an agreed plan.
Are you a banner, Kate?
I'm not in favour of banning this, although I did favour banning fox hunting. I think there is, as Eilidh said, this is a rural business, and there is still room to work with those businesses to improve the practices. As Barry rightly said, there is still far too much illegal prosecution and suffering of birds, and we need to address that. But no, I wouldn't favour banning this activity.
Natalie?
Well, my answer is not going to come to any kind of surprise to Mark at all, since, yes, we would ban it, and I've been delighted to tweet his petition very regularly. Just responding particularly to what Barry said, this is, yes, there are illegal practices associated with it, but this is fundamentally an environmentally destructive industry, and there's simply no way of cleaning it up. And I would also, just because Barry mentioned it too, we'd also ban snaring as a matter of good practice. But grouse shooting is destructive. We can create much better business opportunities, different kind of opportunities from that land, whilst making it much more beneficial environmentally.
William?
I'm with Rupert. I've never shot a grouse, but I would like to see the end of birds of prey, such as the white-tailed sea eagle, being chopped and sliced to death by wind turbines. I also am of the view, again, agreeing totally with Rupert, that these rural communities, their sense of identity goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it is completely and utterly inappropriate for government to try and change rural values that are part of what people give them their very identity. So I think that we should let rural communities embrace their traditional values.
Thank you. Mark? Answer your own question briefly, Mark.
I would. Because the management behind driven grouse shooting increases water bills by polluting water, increases insurance bills by increasing flood risk, increases greenhouse gas emissions by destroying soils, damages wildlife sites, and kills off some quite pretty birds of prey. It's economically trivial to the economy, and it's for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many, so I would ban it.
There we are. We've just got time for one more question, which is from Lydia Cole. Lydia.
So, if you were all 20 again, and knew that you would be in politics for 40 years without the pressure of being elected out, what bold decision would you make that would actually make a sustainable contribution to the future of the planet?
There we are. There we are. Imagine you're 20. Very easy for some of you. 40 years you've got in front of you. Oh, my goodness. The bold decision that would actually make a sustainable contribution. You're going to make one decision, correct? We only want one decision, don't we? Yeah, absolutely. Very importantly, only one decision, Lydia says. So, your one bold decision. Who would like to start on this? Kate.
Well, I genuinely believe that if I was 20 again, and some of the interests that I had at that time, which were around climate change and resource degradation, that I would want a Nature Act that would actually enshrine in legislation why nature is important for its own sake, and also because it has fundamental benefits to people's health, well-being and quality of life. So if I was 20, I'd be campaigning for a Nature Act.
There we are. Barry.
If I were ever 20, I'm not quite sure, I think I was born much older than 20, but if I were ever 20 again, what I would do is I wouldn't go into politics. I would actually learn how to manage forests. And I would go and I would manage them, particularly tropical forests, which I've had quite a lot to do with. And I think I would spend my life doing that.
You can do that. You're young enough, you get out now. Don't stand at the next election. All those voters getting in your way. Don't study away.
All the sorts of benefits that Kate was talking about, of quality of life and health and so on, I would then reap as my reward.
Natalie.
Well, when I was 20, I was studying soil science, and one of the fascinating things that I now know, if we're imagining I'm 20 now, is when I studied soil science, it was a chemistry subject, and we now understand that it's an intensely complicated biology, ecology. So since you put that 20 age year thing in, and I have to think about soils, I would say that I would have to create a whole series of measures to protect our soils.
A long time ago, there was a very popular radio wag wisdom of the rural community. He was a farmer called A.G. Street, and he used to say, and he was much mocked for it by some, he used to say, the answer lies in the soil. Actually, he was pretty well spot on, wasn't he?
He was indeed.
Thank you. William, here we are. Here we are. 20 years old you are. You can do the one thing.
It's a very short answer, and I can guarantee you it will be the most unpopular, but I would repeal the Climate Change Act.
Is that because you're a denier?
Absolutely not. No. I just think that it's, as I said before, I think it sets wholly unrealistic targets. And as I said at the very beginning, I don't think that it deals with the reality of the energy problem we have today. Thank you.
Okay, just on climate change itself. Do you believe?
No, I'm not a climate change denier.
So do you believe that human beings contribute and have contributed so significantly towards climate change as the international panel?
Jonathan, I'm not a scientist, but my wife's in the audience. I bought her an expensive pair of snow tyres about 3 months ago, and they have not been used once. And I can tell you, 20 years ago, we could never reach our house. It was always snowed in. So on that totally non-scientific point, I do believe the world is getting warmer. But I think there is a counter-argument, and I'm only quoting Matt Ridley, who I'm sure knows a lot more about it than most people in this room, that there are large cycles of climate change, and there is an argument that although we have had obviously record temperatures, we could possibly be at the end of a cycle as opposed to the sort of doom-mongering. So I'm not a scientist, and I'll stick with the snow tyre theory. Thank you.
Okay. Rupert de Mauley.
Jonathan, thank you. Well, I do feel 20 from time to time, and if I was 20, and indeed if I was 57, which I am, and I had a clean slate, setting aside everything else we've discussed this evening, I want to stop illegal wildlife trafficking. It's not only destroying beautiful species in Africa and Asia, but it's also destroying communities, and it's financing organised, global organised crime. We need to stop consumption absurdly of products like rhino horn, the illegal use of ivory. We need to promote sustainable livelihoods for the people who live in the areas where this goes on, so that they are not tempted to help the poachers. And we need to stamp down on poaching.
Yeah.
And Eilidh, there you are, the world's before you, your oyster, your big decision.
I thought it was a very interesting question, actually, not least because it was predicated on the fact that you wouldn't have to face re-election. And to me, that's I would turn that round, because actually I think the accountability is desperately important if we're going to protect our natural environment in the future. And I go back to the point that I made at the beginning about the Scottish Climate Change Act, because the custodians of that will not be the Parliament, but it'll be our citizens, it'll be our civil society, because governments will come and go, but it's our citizens that will hold those governments to account. So I think that's a roundabout way of saying that actually we have to create more accountable government, not less accountable government, notwithstanding that sometimes politicians are tempted to think in very short-term terms. But that act was a really good example, I think, of how you could build consensus around long-term targets, much longer term than is imaginable, I think, in the Westminster environment. And as I say, I think it's the people who will hold the politicians to account on it.
Lydia, you put them on the spot. You may not have reached 20 yet, I'm not sure. But put yourself in that pleasurable position of having that 40 years in front of you without any risk of having to be re-elected.
Well, I'm an ecologist, not an economist, so this might be very naive, but I think just questioning growth and the growth that we're that the government seems to be allowing or just basing, I think, underlying policies on. I think questioning that and thinking of what is actually sustainable is needed.
I'm going to go back to the panelists. It's a very, very interesting question. After the crash, 2008-9 crash, there were a lot of politicians who, looking at the catastrophe that the banks and others had created, for a time, in the main parties, in private conversation, were saying, yes, we can't just constantly borrow and grow, borrow and grow, borrow and grow. The green agenda, as it were, was quite powerful. There was a question here about which comes first. We had so many questions, and perhaps we should have done this. You know, is the environment part of the economy, or is the economy part of the environment? It's obvious from your perspective, it's the economy is part of the environment. We're talking about sustainability, sustainable development, in terms of not exactly limits to growth, but only that growth that was demonstrably sustainable in environmental terms. It is obviously the case when you look at Europe, the United States, China, India, all the countries of the world, very few of them, in practice, whatever they say, put that perspective on the policies that they adopt, although they pay, and often really sincerely mean it, I was going to say pay lip service to, really sincerely regard the environment as very, very important. So just quickly around the panel, are there, I mean, it's an old-fashioned phrase now, but are there, quotes, limits to growth? William?
Well, I think that the word sustainable, if you don't mind me saying, is one of those
Please.
absolutely impossible words to interpret. And in the planning system, everything is sustainable. So I'm afraid I'll answer your question by saying I would like you to define sustainability.
Right, I've been trying to do that all my life. Natalie?
Well, I think, Lydia, that your answer is not at all naive. It does actually cut to the crux of where we are now. And to quote a very old small g green phrase, we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And one of the reasons that, why we're at a crunch point now, and I think, Jonathan, you said in 2010, in the year or two after that, people thought things might really change. But actually in 2010, people thought things were going to recover, we'd had a crash and they'd go on much as they had before. It's now clear that our whole economic model, our whole way of approaching things has failed, not just environmentally, but also economically. We are an incredibly fragile economic state. It's also failed socially. Eilidh referred to food banks use in Britain, the fact that Shelter found that 11% of households in January weren't sure if they could pay their rent or mortgage. What we've got now isn't delivering. We need a total change in the whole economic model, the whole way of doing things, and that focus on GDP growth is actually at the core of our problems.
Focus on GDP growth is at the core of our problems. Rupert.
Well, what I am absolutely convinced about is that our economy is completely dependent on our environment, and that our environment is completely dependent on our economy, and we shouldn't trash either of them.
Thank you. And Kate?
Well, it is a finite planet, so there are ultimately limits to growth. What I think we need to do is to better build in our understanding of the environmental resources on which we rely for our economic growth and for our socially cohesive societies into our accounting, and therefore initiatives such as building our natural capital into our GDP assessments that the Treasury has, because let's not forget it's the Treasury who often controls so much of what happens in future government policy. That is absolutely critical for the future, to ensure that natural capital is part of our future approach to accounting.
Eilidh.
I think climate change presents an enormous challenge to 20th century economic models and 20th century economic thinking. There's no two doubts about that. But I would also say that some of the things we've talked about this evening, whether that's the development of renewable energy, whether that's the development of food security and food production, or whether that's about greater energy efficiency. All these things offer great economic opportunities as well as risks, and I think we need to be able to grasp those opportunities, especially in innovation and technology, because that's also a win-win for everybody.
Barry.
You're absolutely right that GDP is a measure of economic activity. It's not actually a measure of real growth. What you have with GDP is a system, let's say you chop down a forest and you export the timber from that forest. Well, the value of the timber is about 30% of the total value that that forest was providing. So the person who owned the forest may well have benefited, and it will show GDP growth to the economy. But the loss to the economy in soil stabilization, in foraging and food and natural resources for the local community, for flood alleviation, watershed protection, all of that is 70% of the value. Those are the figures from the UN. So what you've actually done is you have shown GDP growth whilst your country has become poorer. And that's the con that GDP perpetuates. And that's why we need to understand the value of natural capital. We need a proper accounting system. That's what the system of environmental economic accounting is designed to do. And that's why we need to be there by 2020, having those parallel accounts in our own national accounting framework, so we take the correct decisions in those cost-benefit analyses.
From which I draw the conclusion that if Ed Balls were to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, the idea of GDP growth would be expunged from the lexicon of the nation.
No, I didn't say expunged, but if and when we have a Labour Chancellor, then we will be committed to those parallel accounts that are modelled along the system of environmental economic accounting, because we need to take better decisions in government. We can only do that if we understand the value of the natural capital that at the moment is being degraded.
Thank you very much. And that's where we do come to an end. We've discussed across quite a wide field the questions you put, and we haven't dealt with all of it in the kind of detail which many of you, and certainly the panel, could. But I think that you get quite a good idea of where the different parties are coming from on these issues. The election is 8 weeks away. Very soon, I think in the next 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we'll have the manifestos, which you'll be able to look at and you'll be able to assess the quality of those manifestos. If you're very keen, you'll be able to read them all and compete with yourself, as it were, between what they say in the environment. And then you'll be deciding whether or not to vote on the basis of what they say on the environment, or whether there'll be a lot of other factors involved as well. In any event, I hope that, like I have, you found the contributions from the panellists and from the floor stimulating, enjoyable, and from time to time, engagingly provocative. Thank you very much.